Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 16th chapter of the third book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being On the Suspension of the Act in Warfare. The text follows. If one considers war as an act of mutual destruction, we must, of necessity, imagine both parties as making some progress, but at the same time, as regards the existing moment, we must almost as necessarily suppose the one party in a state of expectation and only the other actually advancing, for circumstances can never be actually the same on both sides or continue so. In the time a change must ensue, from which it follows that the present moment is more favorable to one side than the other. Now, if we suppose that both commanders have a full knowledge of this circumstance, then the one has a motive for action, which at the same time is a motive for the other to wait. Therefore, according to this, it cannot be for the interest of both at the same time to advance, nor can waiting be for the interest of both at the same time. This opposition of interest as regards the object is not deduced here from the principle of general polarity, and therefore is not in opposition to the argument in the 5th chapter of the 2nd book. It depends on the fact that here, in reality, the same thing is at once an incentive or motive to both commanders, namely, the probability of improving or impairing their position by future action. But even if we suppose the possibility of a perfect equality of circumstances in this respect, or if we take into account that through imperfect knowledge of their mutual position such an equality may appear to the two commanders to subsist, still the difference of political objects does away with this possibility of suspension. One of the parties must of necessity be assumed politically to be the aggressor, because no war could take place from defensive intentions on both sides, but the aggressor has the positive object, the defender merely a negative one. To the first then belongs the positive action, for it is only by that means that he can attain the positive object. Therefore, in cases where both parties are in precisely similar circumstances, the aggressor is called upon to act by virtue of this positive object. Therefore, from this point of view, a suspension in the act of warfare, strictly speaking, is in contradiction with the nature of the thing, because two armies, being two incompatible elements, should destroy one another unremittingly, just as fire and water can never put themselves in equilibrium, but act and react upon one another until one quite disappears. What would be said of two wrestlers who remained clasped round each other for hours without making a movement? Action in war, therefore, like that of a clock which is wound up, should go on running down in regular motion. But wild as is the nature of war, it still wears the chains of human weakness, and the contradiction we see here is that man seeks and creates dangers which he fears, at the same time will astonish no one. If we cast a glance at military history in general, we find so much the opposite of an incessant advance towards the aim, that standing still and doing nothing is quite plainly the normal condition of an army in the midst of war, acting the exception. This must alone raise doubt as to the correctness of our conception, but if military history leads to this conclusion when viewed in the mass of the latest series of campaigns, redeems our position. The War of the French Revolution shows too plainly its reality and only proves too clearly its necessity. In these operations, and especially in the campaigns of Bonaparte, the conduct of war attained to that unlimited degree of energy which we have represented as the natural law of the element. This degree is therefore possible, and if it is possible, then it is necessary. How could anyone, justify in the eyes of reason the expenditure of forces in war if acting was not the object? The baker only heats his oven if he has bread to put into it. The horse is only yoked to the carriage if we mean to drive. Why then make the enormous effort of a war if we look for nothing else but like force on the part of the enemy? So much in justification of the general principle. Now, as to its modifications, as far as they lie in the nature of the thing and are independent, and especially in special cases. There are three causes to be noticed here, which appear as innate counterposes and prevent the over rapid and or uncontrollable movement of the wheel work. The first, which produces a constant tendency to delay, is thereby a retaining principle, is the natural timidity and want of resolution in the humankind, a kind of inertia in the moral world, but which is produced not by attractive but by repellent forces, that is to say, by dread of danger and responsibility. In the burning element of war, ordinary natures appear to become heavier. The impulsion given must therefore be stronger and more frequently repeated, if the motion is to be a continuous one. The mere idea of the object for which arms have been taken up is seldom sufficient to overcome this resistant force, and if a warlike enterprising spirit is not at the head, feels himself in war in his natural element, as much as a fish in the ocean, or if there is not the pressure from above of some great responsibility, then standing still will be the order of the day, and progress will be the exception. The second cause is the imperfection of human perception and judgment, which is greater in war than anywhere, because a person hardly knows exactly his own position from the one moment to another. It can only conjecture on slight grounds that of the enemy, which is purposely concealed. This often gives rise to the case of both parties looking upon one and same object as advantageous for them, while in reality the interest of one must preponderate. Thus, then, each may think he acts wisely by waiting another moment, as we have already said in the 5th chapter of the 2nd book. A third cause, which catches hold like a ratchet while in machinery, from time to time producing a complete standstill, is the greater strength of the defensive form. May feel too weak to attack B, from which it does not follow that B is strong enough for an attack on A. The addition of strength which the defensive gives is not merely lost by assuming the offensive, but also passes to the enemy, just as, figuratively expressed, the difference of A plus B and A minus B is equal to 2B. Therefore, it may also happen that both parties at the same time not only feel themselves too weak to attack, but also are so in reality. Thus, even in the midst of the act of war itself, anxious sagacity and the apprehension of too great danger find a vantage ground by means of which they can exert their power and tame the elementary impetuosity of war. However, at the same time, these causes, without an exaggeration of their effect, would hardly explain the long stages of inactivity which took place in military operations in former times, in wars undertaken about interests of no great importance, and in which inactivity consumed 9/10 of the time that the troops remained under arms. This feature in these wars is to be traced principally to the influence which the demands of one party and the condition and feeling of the other exercised over the conduct of the operations, as has been already observed in the chapter of the essence and object of war. These things may obtain such a preponderating influence as to make war a half and a half affair. A war is often nothing more than the armed neutrality or a menacing attitude to support negotiations, or an attempt to gain some small advantage by small exertions, and then to wait the tide of circumstances, or a disagreeable treaty obligation which is fulfilled in the most niggardly way possible. In all these cases in which the impulse given by interest is slight, and the principle of hostility feeble, in which there is no desire to do much, and also not much to dread from the enemy, in short, where no powerful motives press and drive, cabinets will not risk much in the game. Hence, this same mode of carrying on war, which the hostile spirit or real war is laid in irons. The more war becomes in this manner devitalized, so much the more in theory becomes destitute of the necessary firm pivots and buttresses for its reasoning. The necessary is constantly diminishing, the accidental constantly increasing. Nevertheless, in this kind of warfare there is also a certain shrewdness. Indeed, in its action is perhaps more diversified and more extensive than in the other. Hazard played with Relot of gold seems changed into a game of commerce with groschen. And on this field where the conduct of war spins out the time with a number of small flourishes, with skirmishes at outposts, a half in earnest, a half in jests, with long dispositions which end in nothing, with positions and marches which afterwards are designated as skillful only because their infinitesimally small causes are lost, and common sense can make nothing of them. Here, on this very field, many theorists find the real art of war at home. In these feints, parades, half and quarter thrusts of former wars, they find the aim of all theory, the supremacy of mind over matter, and the modern wars appear to them mere savage fisticuffs, from which nothing is to be learned, and which must be regarded as mere retrograde steps towards barbarism. This opinion is as frivolous as the objects to which it relates. Where great forces and great passions are wanting, it is certain easier for a packed dexterity to show its game. But is then the command of great forces not in itself a higher exercise of the intelligent faculties? Is then what kind of conventional sword exercise not comprised in and belonging to the other mode of conducting war? Does it not bear the same relation to it as the motions upon a ship to the motion of the ship itself? Truly can't place only under the tacit conditions that the adversary does know better, and can we tell how long he may choose to respect those conditions? Has not then the French Revolution fallen upon us in the midst of the fancied security of our old system of war, and driven us from Chalons to Moscow? And did not Frederick the Great in like manner surprise the Austrians, reposing in their ancient habits of war, and make their monarchy tremble? Woe to the cabinet which, with a shilly-shally policy and a routine-ridden military system, meets with an adversary who, like the rude element, knows no other law than of its intrinsic force. Every deficiency in energy and exertion is then a weight in the scales in favor of the enemy. It is not so easy, then, to change from the fencing posture into that of an athlete, and a slight blow is often sufficient to knock down the wall. The result of all the causes now adduced is that the hostile action of a campaign does not progress by continuous, but by an intermittent movement, and that therefore between the separate bloody acts there is a period of watching, during which both parties fall into the defensive, and also that usually a higher object causes the principle of aggression to predominate on one side, and thus leaves it in general in an advancing position, by which then its proceedings become modified in some degree. So, long chapter for today that was somewhat difficult to chew last time. In fact, I made another video aside from that. But, it's really a topic that we have already addressed. In fact, in the second book, Von Clausewitz even states this, and it's about the suspension of the act of warfare, in warfare proper. That is to say, as we have explained in the relative episode we referenced before, due to actually this properly physical dimension we could talk about, that actually includes the one of the psyche that is somewhat brought to a halt, right? Because we can't simply do things all of a sudden. The parallelism is very easy with every action we carry out in life. So there is always a moment we have to go for something. Therefore, we're very driven. We decide that we have to invest all the possible resources that are needed, even if the thing goes in worse circumstances, or at least taking the risk. But of course, we don't do the thing like immediately, quickly, swiftly, without any divert, right? We can't foretell the future. We don't know how the thing will go, and in war this is even worse, because there is probably someone that is pushing from contrarily to us, against us, and increases definitely the complications. So there's always a moment at which we have to stop to reflect, and to in front of new challenges, to say what's the next move, right? This is probably the point. And here Von Clausewitz brings the topic to a higher level, let's say, explaining how fundamentally a real warfare. So in the second chapter we've seen mostly how this relates to the the world of physical reality, I mean, in theory and why certain limitations occur, but in the practice now of warfare, in the art of war, how should we address exactly the suspension of the act in warfare? How does it happen normally, and fundamentally, how can how does the mechanism of war work, effectively, efficaciously, in spite or thanks to the suspension probe, right? And this is very intuitive to answer in many ways, because given what we've just said, you understand what can come across, right? That will oblige you to stop at some point. So von Clausewitz says, okay, on the suspension of the act in warfare, says, if one considers war as an act of mutual destruction, we must of necessity imagine both parties as making some progress, right? So the idea is that, if you imagine that in this ideal, actually, absolute war that doesn't belong to reality, but it's in let's say, imminently what war is about, right? The idea is that I want to crush you, you want to crush me, and we will have just to go there and do it, right? And exhaust ourselves in the attempt, in the effort, and one of the two will emerge victorious. So maybe even crush, the both of them in the process. So we imagine here, von Clausewitz says, theoretically a constant motion, right? But he says, but at the same time, as regards the existing moment, we must almost as necessarily suppose that the one party in a state of expectation and only the other actually advancing, for circumstances can never be actually the same on both sides, or continue so, right? So we have to acknowledge that there is definitely as we have seen, a mitigation to not much to the real world in physical terms, but even on who's doing what and for which reason. It's not that we can be driven exactly by the same number of force, even if we try to level this in comparison to asymmetry, for example, to the fact that we employ different means, that we have different strengths, right? So this is actually kind of normal, and this produces a mechanism that we have observed, and von Clausewitz now will refer to the intrinsic difference between attack and defense, right? Attack being the positive form of war, but also the weaker. Defense being the negative form of war, but also the strongest. And naturally, all the degrees of reality in which the shade of this all changes continuously, right? There is time. In fact, von Clausewitz says, in time a change must ensue, from which it follows that the present moment is more favorable to one side than the other, right? So at some point, circumstance will bring to different behavior from both sides. And now, if we suppose, he goes on, that both commanders have a full knowledge of this circumstance, then one has a motive for action, which at the same time is a motive for the other to wait, right? So, as we've seen in the first book, actually, that there is a set of reciprocal laws in warfare that definitely get down to the fact that, in fact, we're not fighting against a passive static force, but we're fighting with a reacting body of the enemy, mind and soul, body and soul, actually, that will modify not just his own action on the base of our influence, but also vice versa throughout all the whole thing. So even when you crush an enemy, and that still has an influence, it obviously has a positive one, but you still depend on that. In a way, this is naturally very important. Von Clausewitz then writes, now, if we suppose that both commanders have a full knowledge of this circumstance, then the one has a motive for action, which at the same time is a motive for the other to wait. Okay, we already read it. Therefore, according to this, it cannot, for the interest of both at the same time, to advance, nor can waiting be for the interest of both at the same time. Right. So it's obvious that the same realization that there is an advantage of a disadvantage related to a certain action that reflects this low reciprocity that goes either at the advantage or disadvantage of you or the enemy, and vice versa, brings this necessary suspension. Right. Gives if there are many reasons for which this happens, but mostly are, as we will see now, even related to gaining information about what effect you're inflicted on the enemy. What about throwing a punch in someone's face and that it's not throwing a punch, it's such a, it has a cost in itself, so you want to acknowledge how the thing went, right? If you deliver, knock them out or not, and or if the enemy is going to strike back, that is enormously important, and it requires a moment of let's see what happens, right? Which is not naturally, that is always present, because in the physical world it is present. Ideally shouldn't happen. Ideally, if war was absolute, was just a titanic clash, like in a dualist vision of the universe, the thing would basically finish in 1 second, because the thing will exhaust itself. Instead, no, we have seen how this thing is very gradual, and von Clausewitz will we will emphasize it in a while now. And then he writes, this opposition of interest, right, as regards the object, right? So here there is an opposition of properly what is convenient to you or not, is not deduced here from the principle of general polarity, right? And therefore is not in opposition to the argument in the 5th chapter of the 2nd book. It depends on the fact that here, in reality, the same thing is at once an incentive or motive for both commanders, namely the probability of improving or impairing their own position by future action. So compared to what we have seen in the previous book, that is definitely connected to it, but there is something different. That is to say, there is a situation with which you have to cope, right? It's not this constant iron arm that is not mutual, because that is only mutual, and for which the thing of polarity fundamentally reflects itself immediately. No, there is probably a moment in which the situation changes, and both sides are kind of amazed at the point they have to determine whether now it's actually a convenient thing to do that or not, right? And most of the time it's not clear at all. We've seen it, that by definition, this is often not clear, right? It can be clear in theory, but in practice you hardly know when it's actually the right way, and there are lots of factors that naturally can alter that throughout the whole thing, including your own effort to have gotten to that point and having even produced that situation, at least ideally. So there is this literally gradual, right, shading of things you can do, right? There is probably an intensification of warfare. You could even point all in a mass attack all of a sudden, getting closer to this kind of absolute form of warfare. But how would that be convenient in reality, right? What do you know is actually standing in between, literally even just you and the enemy, right? Not just what you don't know about the enemy, which is a very few most of the times, in fact, but probably what the whole situation can evolve like into. So this naturally is dictated by the pressure that is brought by politics, by society on war at the same, by at least from this to via politics on war at every single moment, right? But it's fundamentally, a matter for the commander that has to exploit this military art of command to determine, in a properly military sense, to say, is this the right moment or not? Is this the right choice or not? And what von Clausewitz is saying here is that a stalemate doesn't quite, cannot quite follow in this regard, right? It's mostly even here a mathematical principle. It can't be two perfectly different forces actually, bringing to the freezing of the of the picture, because your forces and the one of the enemy and the same general aim and direction, etc., bring the situation to a standstill because of it from a strictly military point of view. The standstill can arrive, but it's still aimed at the thing to move on, right? And gaining forces, doing whatever the need is, right? And this brings, in fact, to the suspension probably of the act of warfare, right? Literally, your army remains there in a camp for months, right? Think about, besieging. There is a lot of examples actually we could draw in here, but it's interesting because von Clausewitz actually comes up with at the end, which is how the Napoleonic Wars, in many ways, the rise of the nation state brought on the table to demonstrate this continuous and extremely impetuous kind of warfare that grew closer to the one of absolute. Obviously not reaching it, not even World War II reached it, but the idea is that because it's unreachable by definition. And in fact, von Clausewitz says, but even if we suppose the possibility of a perfect equality of circumstances in this respect, or if we take into account that true imperfect knowledge of their mutual position, such an equality may appear to the two commanders to subsist. So this is interesting because it's even about, we've seen how properly in the strategic action, even the idea of things that maybe are not there does actually have a strategic weight in the decisional process and as a consequence in the action. Still, the difference of political objects does away with this possibility of suspension. That is to say, as always, as war is a continuation of politics by other means, sometimes politics doesn't give a freaking damn if on the field something, shouldn't be done. You must do it, and you're pushed to do it. Some of the greatest military disasters in history, that are very interesting to study in regard. It's not much because the military was incompetent, but because the political guides pressed to the point of saying, do it. And doesn't matter that the rest, some of the greatest disasters, think about it. The first thing that comes to my mind right now actually is the Italian invasion of Greece during World War II. Like, it's not that the Italian military commands were said, okay, well, now we can invade Greece from Epirus, from these mountains, were, all guarded, said, they wrote to Mussolini and said, look, this is unfeasible. Mussolini said, screw this, go away, and disaster arrived, right? And this is extremely important because the sheer, basically dominance of politics or warfare is literally the single most important thing that we have to understand about warfare itself, right? Here we are studying this chapter properly, the military dimension of the story, right? Which is, for Clausewitz, doesn't actually. This is a purely military treatise, right? Von Clausewitz doesn't talk about politics properly, right? It just or society. It just explains how they interfere with war, right? But this is the latter point is exactly the single most important point. We've seen in the first chapter. That is to say, there's not even a single moment in which politics can't take away all what's happening at one moment in the field of battle, right? In this regard, I mean, aside from the passage from, we've seen it in the previous chapters, from the tactical level to the reconnection of the strategic one, and then politics decides, but at every single second, politics can't call this off, and at the same time giving green light and actually imposing that to happen, no matter what, militarily speaking. So the point of the story here is that someone started a war for whichever reason, having invested a freaking lot of stuff, because the armed forces here the commander is employing are part of the military of a state, so a polity, and they are produced by society. So this has an enormous cost, right? We will see later on with example of the cook that von Clausewitz makes, the horse. That is very fascinating, but that's exactly the point. You didn't go to war to play chess, a deterministic game when things can stop because just I'm scared. Politics doesn't give a damn about it. It always pushes on it and will unlock the thing, whichever thing will go, right? And this doesn't have anything to do even with those situations that apparently are a stalemate, right? Think about the Western Front during World War I. For 4 years, that front didn't move, if not over a few tens of kilometers, right? But that still has nothing to do with what was actually happening, because the new troops were sent in, millions of people to be slaughtered there, and the thing was evolving as hell, right? So never confuse the thing here as, that's a failure of warfare, that's a failure of politics. That's literally understanding nothing about the whole thing, right? I like to target this misunderstanding, especially World War I, that is, used as a paradigm of, monstrosity or dishumanity of warfare. Warfare being probably and possibly the single most human thing that exists. Like, no other, it doesn't happen in the other place. Fights and conflicts happen, but war is even in the animal kingdom, but, this thing we do as humans in an organized political fashion, it's truly unique to humanity. So if there is something truly human, is war, right? And it has a logic. Like, refusing to understand these logics equates to refuse basically one major chunk of what humans do in history, generally speaking, and therefore failing to understand everything about politics, about society, right? One reason why properly we are so grossly disoriented from a civical, from ethical, political point of view, it's properly because warfare is not understood, because the whole idea of conflict that makes war originating is breaking out, is at some point, is exactly not understanding the whole line, right? The how the whole dynamic works, and this is very, very serious. So, von Clausewitz writes, one of the parties must of necessity be assumed politically to be the aggressor, because no war could take place from the defensive intentions on both sides. This is quite evident, right? There's someone goes out there and just like, this is beautiful how, it's beautiful how von Clausewitz starts the Vom Kriege. It says, just imagine war is a duel. Like, just think of any confrontation you've ever had in your life, and you can easily see who is the aggressor, right? There's nothing to do whether he's right or wrong, right? That's falling out of matter. That's because of politics. But militarily speaking, who is that strikes the first blow, right? That's how simple as it is, right? And don't let yourself confused by politics, by propaganda, dialectic. That's nothing to do with that. This is pure military stuff, and it's crystalline clear, right? In its dynamic. Von Clausewitz writes, but the aggressor has the positive object, the defender merely a negative one, right? This is very important because there are, as we have seen, certain intrinsic characters to attack and defense that change the thing a big deal, and that are properly the ones that alter the status, if we really want to be precise about it. And in fact, von Clausewitz says, to the first then belongs the positive action, for it is only that means that it can attain the positive object. Therefore, in cases where both parties are in precisely similar circumstances, the aggressor is called upon to act by virtue of his positive object, right? So this has to do with that balance we were saying before, right? There is one side that has the greater need of acting, right? And the thing can go into a stalemate for some time, but it cannot last for much long, because why did you do this in the first place, right? And then war stops, literally, by definition. And I know this is kind of puzzling. In fact, von Clausewitz writes, therefore, from this point of view, suspension in the act of warfare, strictly speaking, is in contradiction with the nature of the thing, because two armies, being two incompatible elements, should destroy one another unremittingly, just as fire and water can never put themselves in equilibrium, but act and react upon one another until one quite disappears. What would be said of two wrestlers who remained clasped around each other for hours without making a movement? Action in war, therefore, like that of a clock which is wound up, should go on running down in regular motion. But wild as is the nature of war, it still wears the chains of human weakness. And the contradiction we see here is that man seeks and creates dangers which he fears at the same time will astonish no one. So this whole equilibrium that we have looked at is like saying, but there is a contradiction, because you see, if there is always one side that is different from another, this will automatically bring to an evolution of the situation, and which is actually what happens, right? Especially when you realize that the military instrument is employed in a context that is moving, and where the moral, the thing will go on. The more the will of the sides will change, will be addressed towards different directions. So the question is, why is there stalemate sometimes, where a situation where both sides do not act, right? The easy answer to this could easily be because of politics, right? But there is not just that. There's probably another factor, right? Because politics, as we've seen, is overwhelming. From a strictly military point of view, so for the sake of the theory of military art, the question is that there is an extra factor, that is the fact that humans fundamentally are weak, right? The two armed forces are not two, cold-blooded machines that do not think and just act, right? That do not fear, that do not care about themselves, that do not have anything to lose into that, right? And the same reason why, after all, we, just in brutal dynamics, armies break at some point, because otherwise we would just simply annihilate each other, and the survivors of stand. I think it would be enormously more bloody than war actually is in reality. But there is this other element that sometimes people fear, right? And it's not just a matter it's not a cowardice properly, but it's properly a fault in the human capabilities as a biologically speaking. We'll see now better, and we also have already addressed, actually, I think in the second book, these elements. Von Clausewitz writes, in fact, if we cast a glance at the military history in general, we find so much the opposite of an incessant advance towards the aim. The standing still, right, and doing nothing is quite plainly the normal condition of an army in the midst of war. This is important. Standing still and doing nothing is quite plainly the normal condition of an army in the midst of war. Acting, conversely, the exception. Right? This must almost raise a doubt as to the correctness of our conception, but if military history leads to this conclusion when viewed in the mass, the latest series of campaigns redeems our position. So here, actually, von Clausewitz is making an historicistic assessment. That is basically saying, look at what happened, in most of military history, and you'll see that fundamentally armies, tend to just being this, elephantic system that, needs to move slowly, that has all the supply chain, logistics, and first goes here, then goes there, throughout months of campaign, and then just coming to a major clash, right? And however, yes, the situation still evolves. That is, von Clausewitz is not interested in here to point it out, but he's making actually a more powerful point. That is to say, look at what happened comparatively in the Napoleonic Wars, and compare them to what happened in the previous times. Like here we see, actually he explains it much better than me. He says, the War of the French Revolution shows too plainly its reality and only proves too clearly its necessity. In these operations, and especially in the campaigns of Bonaparte, the conduct of war attained that unlimited degree of energy which we have represented as the natural law of the element. This degree is therefore possible, and if it is possible, then it is necessary. Right. So, in other words, the French properly, and especially here, Napoleon's example is taken into consideration, because naturally, he was at the head of that system that had, unchained, unrestricted this mass forces, breaking with the ancien regime, creating the nation state, and a nation-style army, like the French one of the Napoleonic era, that properly showed the world what the heck is possible compared, to the war that had been fought just in the previous generation, right? Just by sheer quantity, right? Which you might say, well, it's kind of a relative example, yes, but it still has a point, because objectively it presents the, a different scale of, action that was definitely much speedier, much more energetic in general, much more powerful, right? And for reasons now we will hopefully explain at one point, but that naturally have to do with a much greater degree of military training, organization, commitment, and for reasons that we're starting to press pretty hard, right? You don't invade the whole Europe if you don't have something that really wants to make you do it very strong, right? This can be observed in every circumstance. These things actually happen, right? The same goes for, think about how much was lost in World War I. What World War II actually was all over the globe, right? In more even terms, say in the first one. And for Clausewitz says, how could anyone in fact justify in the eyes of reason the expenditure of forces in war if acting was not the object, right? So this thing was, we skipped the last part, and it says, that this is not just possible, but that was evidently necessary, right? So the necessity naturally comes from politics on the military instrument, but it's definitely, in fact, something that can happen, because the army itself has no direction, has no action, has no, it must be put there contextually for some reason, right? And this is the point where Von Clausewitz says, the baker only heats his oven if he has bread to put into it. The horse is only yoked to the carriage if we mean to drive. Why then make the enormous effort of a war, if we look for nothing else by it, but like a force on the part of the enemy? And this is the real point. And that's where you connect dramatically, really, what how politics and war really work, right? And why war exists in the first place, right? And why we have demonized the concept of war as a sort of, spiritual, ghostly entity that, comes to plague humanity for some unknown reason. What do you think we study history for? What do you think that people went to die for? Just because of someone's, systemic mistake? You can't send millions of people to die if these people themselves are not driven like hell for doing it. And refusing that is just pretending that humanity is just pure nice and it's just evil few people, the tyrants, that decide this all, and that the rest has no responsibility is like you're an infant, intellectually speaking, not even intellectually, but properly. You don't understand the hell where you live. You have been living throughout all in this life. What do you think this world, this endless bath of blood that human history is for? For fun, by mistake, for some reason that it's not valid, it's not worth it. This is serious. Like, I'm very serious myself in this, because that's the whole point. Like, we will do this in the first place. Then we could explain why conflict emerges and how this is inescapable, but this is exactly the point we're making here. Conflict always exists, and that's what pushes people to go at war, because against one another, because and understanding the reasons is the sap of all politically, socially. And if you don't get that, you can't study war. Or better, you can understand it at least, that comes with time. But that's what we're making these videos for. And Von Clausewitz says, so much in justification of the general principle. Now, as to its modifications, as far as they lie in the nature of the thing and are independent of special cases. There are three causes to be noticed here, which appear as innate counterpauses and prevent the over or rapid uncontrollable movement of the wheel work. The first, which produces a constant tendency to delay, and is thereby a retarding principle, is the natural timidity and want of resolution in the human mind. Right? A kind of inertia in the moral world, but which is produced not by attractive but by repellent forces, that is to say, by dread of danger and responsibility. Now, if you think at your life as a human, not I can say even as an average human, probably as a human by definition, you can't perfectly understand what von Clausewitz is talking about. We've seen how resolution in the second book is this peculiar form of courage, that is to say, not just having courage to stand in front of a machine gun and getting gunned down, in fact, which is just plain stupid, but resolution is basically having the courage to do to follow up on your your decisions, whichever they were, right, and therefore transferring theory into action, right. And von Clausewitz attributes to this natural timidity, because it's normal to be scared, like that's literally something we have because of, instinctively for self-preservation. But as humans, naturally, we're a bit more evolved, mentally speaking, and we can understand that, for example, if we don't act immediately, we're apparently there are not much of threats immediately, but in the long run it will be worse. Well, that's why people may go to war, for example. And therefore, lacking this instinct this capacity, this broader, realization is actually pretty serious, right? Von Clausewitz derives this inertia in the moral world that is not produced by attractive but repellent forces. That is to say, it's not that you're driven positively to do something, whichever it is, but basically you don't, just because you feel you want to stay away from danger and responsibility, towards which humanity generally has a dread for. And this is important because it makes you realize how important even the war properly, as in the broader Clausewitzian sense, it is to say literally in every act of violence, sometimes even the cowardice plays a part. What about someone that is aggressing someone else and you just pass by and you don't do anything about it? Maybe that person dies and you have done nothing to help. That's an enormous deal. I mean, it could be better for you, but it may not be better overall in the general range of possibility, because maybe if you join the fight, yes, you may and kill yourself, but maybe you could have even prevented that, and that person would be alive. It wouldn't destroy a family life, and the potential there is really worth thinking. Maybe I should have taken action, but there is this timidity, in fact, and lack of resolution for which you automatically feel to stay away from, not just from danger, right? Because it's not just a merely self-preserving stuff. Here, von Clausewitz rightfully points out responsibility. And we can extend that to say, where were those people who allegedly were such pure angels that were forcibly sent to war by the regime, where they were seeing Jews being deported? I don't know, in Nazi Germany or in any other country where this were enacted. Where was the courage, the purity, the noble values of those people who fought for their country when they're so that actually their fellow countrymen being deported and sent to what presumably everybody maybe didn't quite know fully but could easily understand they were sent to, and we all know what we're talking about. That's pure cowardice. There is nothing honorable in what those people did. There is nothing honorable in not having stepped and say, this is wrong, right? First of all, because a sound part of them was actually good with that, and this is what we try to uselessly conceal most of the time, historically speaking, so that we are rehabilitating certain things on the base of kind of national, fascinations or moral depravity. Because at the end of the day, this is literally what the degree of responsibility really is, and this is very important historically speaking, as much as it is in true action, right? And von Clausewitz makes it pretty clear. And this is the point that, for example, there is this idea, you're really a wise, intelligent person if you just flatten conflict. The point is, or if you don't break out, like if you don't want to quarrel ever, if you're kind of avoid confrontation, the question is, argue. Like, I can agree that, trying to flatten the situation and, deal with diplomatically, is most of the times kind of the best of the solution. But is it all of the times? Like, is there really a moral value in teaching your kids, for example, that you should ever flatten the conflict and, pretending problems do not exist? Is this really a responsible, mature, intelligent, honorable behavior? Moral behavior? You think that human civilization was built by letting everybody doing whatever they want? Like, the Vom Kriege is pretty clear about this. Conflict is inherent in human nature. You can, kill someone for even the most stupid reason, if you look at the history of mankind. But the inherent conflict in it is uneliminable. Right, you can't objectively choose whether to go there, do something about it, or not do, and therefore enter in contrast with someone, and the thing can even escalate into violence. But you can't pretend at some point, like if you're oppressed, abused, whatever injustice is done to you over and over again, that you should just flatten the thing, because after all, right, just like the example of the Holocaust before. Right. Oh, well, yes, let's go to send these Jews, to Owens, because after all, let's not, I'm too scared that the regime will maybe do something against me. Let's even second them. Yeah, see what happens. Right. And this is you see, there was a payback there, because Germany was razed to the ground, for example. So even in there, you think your responsibility is like just an individual thing. No, it's a collective business. Your entire country was destroyed. Actually, rightfully, for the greatest majority of how it went, because what your country, that is your government, that is the citizens that gave democratically actually the consent to it, did. And you can't keep whining because your house has been bombed, because your children have been killed after what you have let being done in your own country, right? And this is not to say that I would have, that any of us would have been better than those people. Because turns out, historically speaking, that, when these things happen, the majority of people just follows that. So all the people today act kind of in a liberal sense and say, we're so pure now because you're just a product of a contingent reality. If you had been placed in that reality, you would have been just a persecutor. You would have been a murderer, a criminal. And this is what the history of the thing actually went like. People don't like to be reminded this stuff because fundamentally, what von Clausewitz is pointing out here, they are fundamentally cowards and irresponsible. And this is a pretty big chunk of what human essence is really about. Humans, most of the times, are weak people. Weakness shouldn't be something we're now, we have grown especially last generations, in making them think that they are so brilliant, resourceful, intelligent, strong, empowered people. Most people are literally weak and irresponsible. That is, are subjects that are actually, pretty damaging to the whole society, just rather to themselves. Like, that we shouldn't be much proud of our accomplishments. Like, that when bright times come, we should just think of, how we can keep that going on, and just knowing that darker times will come again, and we'll have to be prepared for it. Right? We have been training our generations to eliminate the acknowledgments that human nature is in many ways weak, right? Timid, weak, irresponsible, incompetent, stupid fundamentally. We're not normal, acceptable people just because we dressed up, because we live in a standard where we can't afford, to have a car or a smartphone or just a roof on our heads, and therefore we're normal, decent people. No, most people are scum. Let's be very honest about this. And they are exactly for this reason. It's a moral problem. They're stupid, timid, irresponsible, incompetent. That is, they cause problems to society because they don't have the guts to do something about themselves. And this is a real problem, an enormous problem. And what von Clausewitz is pointing out here is that in war, this actually creates a lot of extra damage that could be avoided, responsibly speaking. Because Von Clausewitz is a great... Von Clausewitz never says war should be done or shouldn't be done. That is up to you, right? He doesn't address the thing. That's a political matter, and it has nothing to do with what von Clausewitz thinks about whether war should be done or shouldn't be done. And for what emerges from Vom Kriege multiple times is that definitely war is not something that you should be wanting or not wanting to do. It's something that you should be prepared to, because even if you dislike it, and hell, we all dislike it, it may happen to you, and when that comes and you don't know what to do, you're fundamentally the timid and irresponsible, incompetent person that has refused to understand war, and that will bring to himself and his own society ruin, because it's not even able to defend itself. Right? It's actually fortunate that the less democratic, the most dictatorial, anti-democratic regimes are, have a population of, dramatically lower, education and understanding, and because they're weaker systems, right? And so we should be proud to have accomplished something like having built the world that works on a democratic, on a human vision of the same humanity, proper, a realistic view of the same humanity. We cannot shift towards the direction of being self-complacent about it and not knowing even where that stemmed from. That stemmed from 50 million's death, just the generations of our grandfathers. 50 million people killed, right? Plus, actually, and that is just to count World War II. And let's not say what happened just in the meantime. Places like China, like Russia. These are serious problems that you must address. I mean, if you want to be a mature adult person that looks at this world and says, I can have, a meaningful opinion about it. If you must have, otherwise get out of here. Like, there is no room for who does not frame this reality, doesn't sculpt these words into her own brain. There is no other option. This is the beauty of it, that it's so beautifully equal, just in it, right? We're all done for if we don't understand this thing. There's no exception. Von Clausewitz says, in the burning element of war, ordinary natures appear to become heavier. Right? The impulsion given must therefore to be stronger, more frequently repeated in the motion, if the motion is to be a continuous one. The mere idea of the object for which arms have been taken up is seldom sufficient to overcome this resistant force, and if a warlike, enterprising spirit is not at the head, Wu himself bore his natural element as much as a fish in the ocean, or if is not the pressure from above of some great responsibility, then standing still will be the order of the day, and progress will be the exception. Right. So the point von Clausewitz is making here is that war brings out this unchains this strength, these forces that require to be channeled under a proper guide that needs to be morally as elevated as what these forces now are proportionally, right? So, in other words, you cannot think that a timid and irresolute individual will be able to make a difference in this regard, and that for this reason, what happens in war, generally speaking, throughout all the chain of command and the troops, is that there is a general inertia, as von Clausewitz has put in terms, that causes this suspension of the act of war. At least, it decreases the intensity of it. And this is the first element, let's say. The second, von Clausewitz, the second cause is the imperfection of human perception and judgment. Right? This is more of a gnosiological problem. And an intellective problem, which is great in war than anywhere, because a person hardly knows exactly his own position from one moment to another, and can only conjecture on slight grounds that of the enemy, which is purposely concealed. This often gives rise to the case of both parties looking upon and the same object as advantageous for them, while in reality the interest of one must preponderate. Thus, then each may think he acts wisely by wanting another moment, as we have already said in the 5th chapter of the 2nd book. So you understand, this is pretty simple actually. Von Clausewitz is saying, simply we don't know what the hell we're doing most of the times out there in war, because simply we don't know. We don't have enough reliable information. There is no way, especially by definition, to sort out the system. We have made tons of, of videos. Von Clausewitz explained this ad nauseam, but it's one of the single most important aspects of war that it cannot be resolved through a machine, through a calculator. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. The best thing we have is our mind, and that's how we should be leading it, right? Not thinking we can't sort it out scientifically, right? We can't use science to help us, but it's still our minds that decides. But there is an aspect in here, and as a consequence, by the way, just to conclude on the second cause, is that this imperfection of knowledge naturally causes mistakes. That is to say, it's not just that we know how much is concealed. It's like probably we have no idea. And therefore, we don't even know that there's something out there that we ignore completely, and that we don't even think it may be there. This is freezing, actually, and this is sometimes even more serious, telling the truth, than what reality actually is. This is the point that many made. This is something that even Caesar wrote back in the day. Actually, from Clausewitz, you find all these, ideas actually stemming piece by piece from realization about, from mottos and quotes from ancient history that had already realized in these maxims such concepts. So it's a natural consequence in a way, because of this intellective deficit, to bring, let's say, to a halt, because we somewhat assume that we are doing fine, right? That given what we know, maybe it's the right way, and therefore this can bring to misunderstanding, to a mistake, naturally, and to bring the situation to a halt. This is criticized by von Clausewitz in the sense that naturally we should be aware of the fact that this is going on, and that we should always make this effort. We should push for, we should commit ourselves to try to find instead something else that tells us maybe something more, something better, maybe just to confirm that we are right, not necessarily that we are wrong, because we don't know at the moment, right? We just have to determine that, but that in the research, in the pursuit, is the same medicine, let's say, to cure fundamentally this ignorance, right? This is valid in every field. But the thing that strikes me here is, and that is probably not random, is the order that von Clausewitz gave to these causes that bring to the suspension of the act in war. Because the first one, as we have seen, is fundamentally one of moral nature. Right, the one that interferes with, that has to do with intelligence and knowledge is comes only second. That is to say, if you really want to fight a war in an effective sense, it's not even about what you know, frankly, but how determined you are, how responsible you are, and that's the single most important thing. Then, these naturally factors are all blended together at all times, but in terms of importance as a hierarchy, the first cause is the moral dimension. Is the first and foremost thing. Always remember that von Clausewitz defines war as fundamentally a clash between moral forces, first and foremost. It's not that, the physical ones are not important, but fundamentally, it's a matter of will. Remember always what's the objective of war. For von Clausewitz, it's not destroying the enemy. It's not annihilating the enemy to make him physically inconsistent after having, butchered him. The point is simply to compel him to fulfill your will. That's the objective of war. And that's a moral thing, because it's a matter of will, as you understand, and two wills counterposed. So this is brutal, but it's beautiful because it has an intimate coherence that it's literally what happens throughout all humanity. Every time we look at war. Then von Clausewitz talks about the third cause, which says the third cause which catches hold like a ratchet while in machinery from time to time producing a complete standstill, is the greater strength of the defensive form. A may feel too weak to attack B, from which it does not follow that B is strong enough for an attack on A. The addition of strength which the defensive gives is not merely by assuming the offensive, but also passes to the enemy just as figuratively expressed. The difference of an A plus B and A minus B is equal to 2B. Therefore, it may so happen that both parties at one and the same time not only feel themselves too weak to attack, but also are so in reality. Right? This is interesting because it brings on the ratio 1 to 2 in terms of forces, etc. Right? But you understand what the concept here. It's pretty clear, pretty simple, actually. That is that objectively, there is the asymmetry between attack and defense is such for which an advantage on that is difficult to talk about in absolute terms, but let's say in terms of forces put out there, can be in fact exhausted by, for example, an attack. In an attack, at least at a point that the enemy, albeit weaker, will be capable of overwhelming you in a counter-attack, but after or simply through the defense, which actually doesn't mean much, because once someone is defending is beginning to win over the attacker, the counter-attack is the most logical and unescapable consequence in that regard. The point von Clausewitz is making here specifically is that the reality of warfare is not just in an expectancy, bringing people down relatively to the to the necessity of moving for a practical result. It's actually so in reality many times. Like look at medieval warfare that we talk a lot about on Schwerpunkt. Well, once you understand what a castle meant for that kind of warfare, and the fact that there were not many means to surpass that, if not including entire months of sieges, you understand that the standstill at that point is not just a matter of option, but it's literally what that the iron logic of that warfare obliged the systems to do. And this is not an alternative, like all these three factors as we have seen act together. So that is not to say that for that reason in medieval warfare people didn't act more than much, right? In general, here it would be interesting also to make some parallelism, but let's not digress. The point that surely also in there was a problem of knowledge, like what's the enemy forces, concretely, what's the enemy doing, and also this idea, okay, let's slow down, let's not be so responsible or too daring, let's stop here, let's see what happens, right? So von Clausewitz writes, however, at the same time, these causes, without an exaggeration of their effect, would hardly explain the long states of inactivity which took place in military operations in former times, in wars undertaken about interests of no great importance, and in which inactivity consumed 9/10 of the time that the troops remained under arms. This feature in these wars is to be traced principally to the influence which the demands of the one party and the condition and the feeling of the other exercised over the conduct of the operations, as has been already observed in the chapter on the essence and object of war. These things may obtain such a preponderating influence as to make a war a half and half affair. Right? A war is often nothing more than an armed neutrality or a menacing attitude to support negotiations, or an attempt to gain some small advantage by small exertions, and then to wait the tide of circumstances or a disagreeable treaty obligation which is fulfilled in the most niggardly way possible. So, in other words, actually here von Clausewitz is still comparing the thing of the pre-Napoleonic era wars and so on. And this is not a criticism probably of how war was fought, which in part still exists at the theoretical level, at least a theory, the art of war, and the practice was very different in some way by comparison. But he's really talking about the fact that, as we've always said, there is a political mandate for the military instruments. That it is to say, these wars were not fought like kind of more slowly or less intensively, less brutal, because someone had got the military thing wrong. That happened because of the specific context in which these wars broke out, right? And this cannot be discounted. It cannot be, unregarded. When we study, always remember that when you study military history, what you should be looking at is always the context of those wars. Look even at wars that are fought here and there. Look at today what is happening, at the border between Israel and Lebanon, for example, or all those explosions in centrals in Iran. I mean, they're effectively small things, right? These are military things that are going on. Someone making blowing up something, doesn't matter if it's an incursion party or an ATGM or whatever, or a bombing, aerial bombing or whatever. It's like all little instruments of politics. Nothing more, nothing less, and they all have a logic, right? It's not like this is important, I think, in modern politics, but because there are a lot of people who still think that war it's something that you can go at, in fact, without like a football match, right? As if let's just simply crash one country because it will be easier. No, it's not gonna be easier, right? There are other ways that are dominated by politics, and politics already takes care of that. Politics can easily heal way more people than a war. It always does. Nobody cares. And war is just another way of doing it. Right? Blocking, exports to a country can easily kill more people than a bomb strike. We do it all the time. And objectively, what's wrong with that? Right? Given the motives why we do it, that can be valid. Right? And most people's morality seems like a silly, naive dichotomy between, if you use force, you're a brute, and therefore you're bad boo, and that's it. Right? That's how dumb we can get to. Most of I don't know how we can even statistically quantify that, but it's rare to find going around talking with people, looking at social network, someone that says something maybe there is more to that. Maybe reality is worth a bit more of consideration in its complexity, and because it's kind of beautiful. And no, it's about you use violence, then you're bad. Violence is just a tool. The reasons why you use violence is what really makes the moral difference, which is a wholly different matter. But we have talked about this stuff a lot, so I won't be repeating the thing. It's like the gun. The gun is always a gun, but it can be used in a cowardly terroristic attack. It can be used to blow the freaking brains out of that stupid terrorist hand. In the second case, put me in line. I'd love to do that myself, aside from kind of the disgust and the shock of the thing. But what's wrong in killing terrorists who are threatening to kill other people? Absolutely nothing. It's actually a very good thing. We would all hope that it wouldn't happen, but it's very beautiful that we can do it, because we have this responsibility, we have this courage, we have this meaning, we can employ it. And that's seriously beautiful. Hell, we wouldn't like to do it. It's just quoting, a naked gun to be thought-provoking, but I'm really serious about it. Right? We would all love a world without violence, but in order to do that, you would have to eliminate conflict, and you could even infer that conflict is a way, it's the sap of the fuel of civilization in many ways. It's also, the Bible clearly says, original sin, humans are wicked, can't do anything about it, but once they go out there in the world, they start building cities and learning crafts, and in many ways that's probably what human nature is in a nutshell. And that is not just about the fall of mankind, but probably after the humans begin to kill. When Cain kills Abel, he's forsaken, he goes out there and he accepts that, right, as a reality with God. They're very, very neutral about it. He goes out there building cities and learning crafts after having lived well, in that case as a shepherd, where there is the opposition of the agriculture. It's another anthropological thing, but it's essentially after just having been kicked out of the earthly heaven. And that's, in a sense, the beginning of mankind. Bible is quite powerful. It is as also other books, other civilizations, but this is pretty spot on, right? It really depicts accurately, from a scientific point of view, all what we know about mankind in psychological, anthropological, biological term. I mean, it's really that. So yeah, this is, I don't remember what it was. Yes, okay. Then von Clausewitz writes, in all these cases in which the impulse given by interest is slight, and the principle of hostility feeble, in which there is no desire to do much, and also not much to dread from the enemy, in short, where no powerful motives press and drive, cabinets would not risk much in the game. This is exactly what we're talking about. Like, what's the need of fighting a war? Most of the times. Like, either there is a pressing thing that you have to do it forcefully because you're threatened from annihilation. Otherwise, why? But still, you will keep using a bit of, bombing here, surgical strike there. It's normal. Doesn't matter where country you come from. Your armed forces, our armed forces, are continuously killing someone. It's fine. It should be like that. It's no different from, voting or, in a scale of responsibility. It's still part of the same game. Right? And this naturally has consequences, pretty serious ones. I mean, I'm not saying it's good in the sense that, this should go just like that. Like, let's hope it doesn't happen, but it happens less. But let's be thankful of the fact that we have the option of doing it, because, otherwise you would be a pacifist that, a tyrant arrives, takes your land, starts vexating you, abusing you, and you basically will do nothing because you don't want to use violence. Are you crazy? Pacifism is one of the single most, not just irresponsible and but also probably violent ideologies that is out there, because it has a brutality of denial of humanity that is embarrassing, that is literally offensive and criminal in many ways. It is no better than militarism, actually, and they do not exist without the other, as a matter of fact. Yeah. Hence, this same mode of carrying on war, which the hostile spirit of real war is laid in irons. Right? This is really, really correct. Clausewitz says, the more war becomes in this manner devitalized, so much by politics, I would add in bracket, so much the more its theory becomes destitute of the necessary firm pivots and buttresses for its reasoning. The necessary is constantly diminishing, the accidental constantly increasing. This is also very important. I mean, about the necessity of military action, evaluate on the scale of it. Right? This is fascinating because it makes you realize that, indeed, the necessity of certain actions decreases with the decisiveness of the same. And this is particularly powerful because it makes you realize, as we were saying before, that all these minor operations are, let's say, you can you can criticize with the military operation, but it still has a function that you have to understand in that degree of even unnecessity that is optional, right? Which is valid actually for all war in a way. There's always an option for doing that. It's the logic behind it that is understood in this sense. That is to be understood in this sense. Von Clausewitz says, nevertheless, in this kind of warfare, there is also certain shrewdness indeed. Its action is perhaps more diversified and more extensive than in the other. Because in proportion, it's kind of, in fact, crazier, like it's less logical in a way. Hazard played with Relot of gold seems changed into a game of commerce with groschen. And on this field, where the conduct of war spins out the time with a number of small flourishes, with the skirmishes at outposts, half in earnest, half in jest, with long dispositions, which end in nothing with positions, and marches, which afterwards are designated as skillful only because their infinitesimally small causes are lost and common sense can make nothing of them. Here of this very field many theorists find the real art of war at home. In these feints, parades, half-a-quarter thrusts, former wars, they find the aim of all theory, the supremacy of mind over matter, and modern wars appear to them mere savage fisticuffs from which nothing is to be learned, and which must be regarded as mere retrograde steps towards barbarism. This opinion is as frivolous as the objects to which it relates. Where great forces and great passions are wanting, it is certainly easier for a practised dexterity to show its game. But is then the command of great forces not in itself a higher exercise of intelligent faculties? Is then that kind of conventional sword exercise not comprised into belonging to the other mode of conducting war? Does it not bear the same retaliation to it as the motions upon a ship or the motion of the ship itself? Truly, it can take place only under the tacit condition that the adversary does know better, and can we tell how long he may choose to respect those conditions? Has not then the French Revolution fallen upon us in the midst of the fancied security of our old system of war, and driven us from Chalons to Moscow? And did not Frederick the Great in like manner surprise the Austrians reposing in their ancient habits and make their monarchy tremble? Woe to the cabinet which, with a shilly-shally policy and a routine-ridden military system, meets with an adversary who, like the rude element, knows no other law that of his intrinsic force. Every deficiency in energy and exertion is then a weight in the scales in favor of the enemy. It is not so easy then to change from the fencing posture into that of an athlete, and slight blow is often sufficient to knock down the wall. This is very powerful, because connected to the last thing we were commenting on, fundamentally, Von Clausewitz says, Von Clausewitz is fundamentally to each mean its end, each mean for its ends. This is true. And the criticism he is making of, smaller operations in this regard is not much about the smaller operation in an abstract context in itself. Like those strikes we're talking about before, that, little way of acting is important as long as, in a strictly military sense, if you don't have, if you don't consider properly politics as doing most of the job, right? Von Clausewitz here is instead criticizing the idea that warfare should be fundamentally less, in a moment of a series connected with the series of factors that basically decrease the rationale of war, this fear, this responsibility, this incomprehension, this mostly the moral side of the story. He says, if you want to make war, if you have to go to war, just make it in a way that you can eradicate, properly the reason that has brought you to the thing. Ideally, you will not be able to do it, because there is much more to that. But militarily speaking, be decisive. Just do the thing, because in smaller actions you can do something, but only if that is properly measured for that specific political need that you have for doing it. If instead you think to go to war just by, making a ballet and pretending that, just harassing the enemy without proper, further plan is literally like making, concentrating on the oscillations of a ship and not on how, the ship, where the ship should sail for. So you should not be self-complacent about showing you can do with your troops. Showing what theoretically you think the enemy is just going to stay there to look at, but simply to knock out the enemy. Because the more you act, in fact, in this kind of shilly-shallow way, where shallow even fits in this context, is it's not going to, it's easier to take down, to cut it by the same enemy action, right? So this is a very good advice with someone that is, be clear with what your intentions are always. Just don't waste time about something that someone else is not interested in. This is valid in everything, in relationships, in literally everything you do. What's the point of losing time? Time of your life, which is limited. It's pretty short, actually, and fragile. And you waste time for what? Like, you may have some taste for doing it at the moment, but in a broader sense, if you're seriously committed theoretically for something, do not let yourself be mocked by your own timidity and irresponsibility. Just decide what you want and go for it. And do not, enact half measures if the situation really doesn't give you any reason for doing. Same goes for war. Right? And there is probably the moral divide. That is not to say that war functions immanently in a reasonable way, in a positive way. When that there is this debate in history that is to say that there is an immanent logic in the way armies fight throughout all of history, in a sense that those who fought in the past knew definitely better than we do, and therefore we should just shut up and see what they did to try to understand. It's a very good historical point. Historically speaking, I also make it, but militarily speaking, the thing is different. I mean, you should, given you knew exactly what happened, you should be able to say, look, maybe this could have been done better. Given this and that, because and you'll see it most of the times, the problem was actually less, it was more complicated, like, because if, for example, the commander, von Clausewitz criticizes, for example, those historians who says that, after the battle, after the war, everybody's capable of giving an analysis, trying to do it in action. So it's actually correct that most of the times we're definitely no better at all, and we wouldn't make a better job for those people we can criticize in a history book. Certain military operations that weren't done, even I think about Verdun or those are things never been attempted before. Even if they failed, look, at the time it was a big deal, and we know that they failed now, but it's just because at the time nobody had ever tested that, and there wasn't, after all, many other ways to know how it would have done if you hadn't tried to do it. And it might have been bold, it might have been risky, it might have been even irresponsible. Sure, we have seen how it works, but it's no excuse, right? And we should understand that this capacity of looking at reality shouldn't eliminate in its moment the necessity of the logic for which you have gone to war in the first place, which is a brutal one, it's a crushing one, it's an overwhelming one, it's not easy, but it defines what the whole thing should be. And therefore, here von Clausewitz is actually criticizing subtly this position, this criticism that even existed at the time, for example, the Napoleonic Wars towards French tactics that were based on this mass concentration of fire on a certain part of the enemy line, and then this mass charges, cavalry charges in it. Many old-schooled generals said, no, this is kind of a barbaric way of doing war, that there's too mass, no order. Napoleon won that way big time, right? And the reason why he was defeated is because the others started to do the same in part, to make it very simple, of course. But the point is exactly that, is that sometimes the habit, sometimes this incapacity to be able, this, lack of courage of being able to look beyond, brings us to misassessments that do not show us what the reality of war really is. And here, what von Clausewitz, as an idealist, connects an idealist in the philosophical sense proper, in an historical sense, given the context where he lived, etc., how he was learned, educated, etc., is connected to the fact that until, and we've seen it in the previous videos, until you don't do something great, you cannot know fully what your true quality is. If your character is as great as the task you have been committed for. Same reason why von Clausewitz says, among primitive tribes, that there was surely a Hannibal or a Napoleon, but they couldn't emerge because what they did was limited, and that there wasn't that level of intelligence could be displayed for literally testing how good that commander would have been. in a civilized context. And that's exactly the point we're making here. That once you make a war, try to find the best to carry it out. That requires a lot of resources, but if they're well channeled, they can give you the best possible result. Otherwise, the rest is just, as von Clausewitz has called it, like a half and half or a quarter of commitment. That is useless, because this actually gives more room for the enemy reaction, because you don't plan on knocking the enemy down at first shot, and this is going to prolong the war, and over time to likely even increase unnecessarily the losses. That's why von Clausewitz actually begins the Vom Kriege by stating, it's a very naive illusion, to say the least, that the war could be a more humanitarian business was it fought in a lighter way. The most humanitarian thing you can do in war is, make it quick and brutal as you can, but then finish it as quickly as you can. And this is really a great moral realization from a person that enlisted in the Prussian army at 12 and fought all the wars of the coalition against Napoleon, and also died in a military campaign, and that can tell you really what's best after having seen thousands and thousands of people dying in the most horrifying manner. Believe me, if you really want to take an advice from someone about what is more or less humanitarian, take it from a person who has seen all those people dying in the most horrifying way, because he really knows better. And just to conclude, von Clausewitz, and here actually he makes the point, in fact, the Napoleonic era has literally, I can't say revolution, it's a bit of a sensational way of putting things that I don't like, but literally, like the French Revolution has changed an enormous deal probably in the political and social and military organization. So Napoleonic warfare did against military systems that were not much outdated, but probably were counted also on a lesser scale, because they had emerged from a Europe that was, if you want, smaller before, just like it had been for, as the example he made here from the wars of Frederick the Great against the Austrians, that had gone in a similar fashion, right? And this is a huge deal, a really huge deal. Then, concluding, von Clausewitz says, the result of all the causes now adduced is that the hostile action of a campaign does not progress by a continuous but by an intermittent movement, and that therefore, between the separate bloody acts, there is a period of watching during which both parties fall into the defensive, and also that usually a higher object causes the principle of aggression to predominate on one side, and thus leaves it in general in an advancing position by which then its proceedings becomes modified in some degree. So this is the standard. Like throughout most we've seen for 90% of the time, two armies in war proper, that is where the war is being fought, aren't fighting at all. And I stress at all here, like they're not fighting. Actually, they're doing nothing in terms of combat, or putting up to combat. The point though is that they also, as a consequence, get on the defensive, because they say, okay, wait, we stop a moment, and this means that we are essentially defending, because we're not taking action by definition. And yet there is one of the two sides that is that is actually both, but one more than the others, and will mostly, in fact, break this equilibrium, expand more towards the modification of this reality, of this state of this standstill, because it's pushed by the inherent reason why that army is being brought on the field by politics. It keeps pushing all the time, and that will bring to either the continuation of war or to its end, because actually many wars ended without having even destroyed the enemy forces. So this is literally how the thing works in war. That's how you can explain it. That's how it happens. And that's how probably the suspension of war works like. Alright, this was the 16th chapter, and it's an interesting one. We have shorter ones ahead today. I could have split it in two, but I think it was interesting actually to treat it in a whole shot, because it's actually powerful and it's very interesting. Usually the longest chapters are the most important ones, the most insightful. Not always, but you know, they naturally put more on the table and more effective, more stuff to consider. And so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.